"Get in the back closet, Margaret. Right now. Don't make a sound." I stared at my housekeeper, Dorothy, like she'd lost her mind. She was 72 years old, had worked for our family for 19 years, and she was whispering to me in my own hallway like we were hiding from a burglar. "Dorothy, what on earth? Please." Her hand gripped my wrist, and I felt how hard she was shaking. "Please, Margaret, I found something. You need to hear this for yourself." If I just tell you, you won't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. I was dressed for my daughter's graduation. My hair was done. I had on the pearl earrings my late husband Gerald had given me on our 25th anniversary. I was supposed to leave for Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto in 40 minutes. My daughter Claire was about to receive her MBA, and I had been counting down this day for 3 years. And Dorothy was pushing me into the coat closet off the main hallway. "The closet door doesn't close all the way," she said quickly, her voice barely a breath. "You'll be able to hear everything. Don't come out until I come for you, no matter what you hear." Then she shut the door. I stood in the dark between Gerald's old winter coat and a row of umbrellas, and I thought, I am 63 years old and I am hiding in my own closet. Gerald would have laughed until he cried. But Gerald wasn't here. He'd been gone 4 years. And Dorothy had never, not once in 19 years, asked me for anything she didn't have a sensible reason for. So I stayed. I heard the front door open. I heard footsteps 2 sets coming down the hardwood of the front hall. I heard my daughter Claire's voice, and I felt the tight, familiar pride I always felt when I heard her, followed immediately by something else. Something I couldn't name yet. "She wasn't alone. She thinks I've already left," Claire was saying. "Dorothy told her the car service was coming early. We have about an hour. That's enough time." The second voice was a man's, low, careful. I recognized it. It was the voice of my daughter's fiancé. His name was Preston. I want to explain what I mean when I say that, because the name alone doesn't carry what it needs to carry. Preston Caldwell had been in my daughter's life for 14 months. He was 38, 2 years older than Claire. He was handsome in the way that men sometimes are when they've learned to use it, the kind of handsome that opens doors before anyone has decided whether to let them in. He worked in private equity. He had an apartment in the financial district and a ski chalet near Collingwood that he mentioned often enough to make sure you didn't forget it. He spoke the way certain men do when they've decided they're the smartest person in any room and have simply stopped checking. Claire had introduced us at dinner at Canoe on King Street. I'd watched him order the wine without asking her preference, and I had filed it away the way mothers do, in that drawer we keep for things we hope we're wrong about. I had smiled. I had been polite. I had told myself it wasn't my marriage. The engagement had been announced 6 months ago. The wedding was planned for September at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And now he was in my house, in my hallway, and my daughter thought I wasn't home. "The trust document," he said. "Did you find where she keeps it?" Silence. Then Claire said, "Her office. Top drawer of the filing cabinet. It's not locked." Something moved through me then. Something cold that started at the back of my skull and traveled slowly down my spine. I made myself stand perfectly still. And the amendment she was talking about? Preston again. She mentioned it to her lawyer in March. I don't know if it's been signed yet. It needs to not be signed yet. Another silence. Longer this time. I had set up a family trust when Gerald died. It wasn't complicated. It was designed to protect the assets we had built together over 31 years of marriage. A house in Rosedale, investments, a small commercial property in Oakville that Gerald had bought in 2003 and that had appreciated considerably. When I turned 70, or if I passed before that, the trust would distribute to Claire and to our son Thomas, who lived in Vancouver with his husband and their 2 daughters. The amendment I had asked my lawyer, Patricia, to draw up was simple. I was adding a clause that would require any distribution to a married beneficiary to account for the marriage as separate from the inheritance. A standard protection. Patricia had recommended it when Claire got engaged. Preston knew about it. Somehow, Preston knew about it. "If it's already signed, there are still options," he was saying. "It would just take longer." I don't want it to take longer. Claire's voice was different from the voice I knew. Flatter. "I want this settled before the wedding," you said. I know what I said. You said once we were married it was straightforward. You said Canadian law. I said it was more straightforward, not that it was automatic. There's a difference, a pause. If the amendment is already in place, we may need to approach it differently. A legal challenge could take years, and I'm not paying Harrington and Associates for years. I had stopped breathing. I became aware of this when the edges of my vision began to go slightly soft, and I made myself inhale slowly through my nose. Gerald's coat still smelled faintly of him, cedar, and something warmer underneath, something I had never been able to name. I pressed my fingers against the sleeve. My daughter was telling this man about my trust. My daughter was helping him find a way around an amendment designed to protect her own inheritance. I did not want to understand what I was hearing. I want to be honest about that. There is a part of your brain that simply refuses, the way a door refuses when someone has turned the bolt. I stood in the dark and felt my mind pushing against what my ears were giving it, trying to find another interpretation, another arrangement of the words that meant something different. There wasn't one. "I want to see the document," Preston said. Footsteps moving down the hall, toward Gerald's old study, which I used as my office now. Then Dorothy's voice, coming from the kitchen, perfectly calm. "Mr. Caldwell, can I get you something before you go? I've just made coffee." A beat. Then his footsteps changed direction. She was buying time. Dorothy was 62 years old, and she was running interference in my hallway like she'd been trained for it. I stood in the closet for 23 more minutes. I counted them by the clock I couldn't see, measuring the seconds the way you do when you have nothing else to hold on to. I heard Preston's voice and Dorothy's voice from the kitchen, a conversation I couldn't make out, pleasantries stretched thin. I heard Claire moving in the office, the soft slide of a filing cabinet drawer. When Dorothy finally opened the closet door, she didn't say a word. She just looked at me, and her eyes asked if I was all right, and I shook my head very slightly because I wasn't, and she reached out and straightened my pearl earring, which had turned crooked in the dark. Then she handed me my coat. I need to go back to the beginning, because this is not where the story starts. Or it is where it starts for me, standing in the dark in my own home, listening to my daughter, but it isn't where the story starts for Dorothy. She had started seeing it in March. She told me all of it that afternoon, after Preston's car left the driveway. We sat at the kitchen table with the coffee she'd made as a decoy still sitting between us, and she told me everything in the methodical, careful way that Dorothy did everything, the way she'd raised 5 children and nursed her mother through Alzheimer's and survived a car accident at 58 that had left her with a slight tremor in her left hand that she managed by always holding her coffee cup with her right. She had noticed the phone calls first. Preston had been at the house in March for Sunday dinner. Claire had started bringing him regularly by then, and Dorothy had been clearing the table when she heard him in the front sitting room, speaking in a low voice. She hadn't meant to listen. She'd simply been walking past. The trust is structured around the Ontario legislation. If we're inside the marriage when the distributions happen, the standard application would include, and then he'd lowered his voice further and she'd lost the thread. She had filed it away. She wasn't sure what it meant. She told herself maybe she'd misheard. Then in April, she'd taken a phone message for Claire Preston, asking Claire to call him back, nothing unusual. But when she'd written the message on the notepad on the counter, she'd pressed down harder than usual, and when she tore the sheet off, the impression on the page below was still there. She hadn't read it on purpose. She'd just seen it. It was a name, Harrington and Associates, and a number. She'd looked them up. They were a firm that specialized in estate litigation. In May, she'd heard Claire on the phone in the garden, not the sitting room, where voices carried differently. Dorothy had been upstairs, window open. She'd heard 2 things clearly. "She trusts me completely, Preston," and "she won't see it coming." Dorothy had sat down on the edge of the guest bed and stayed there for a long time. She told me she had asked herself whether she was being foolish, whether she was reading something sinister into nothing, whether her fondness for me was making her suspicious of a young man who might simply have been having a normal conversation about finances. She had decided she needed more before she came to me. What she'd found in the 3 weeks since was enough. Preston Caldwell had been married before. Not briefly. Not in his early 20s, he had been married for 6 years, to a woman in Calgary, and the divorce had been finalized 18 months before he met Claire. The divorce had involved a protracted legal dispute over his former wife's inheritance from her mother. Dorothy had found the court records through a public database. Preston had not won, but he had delayed the final settlement long enough that his ex-wife's legal costs had consumed a significant portion of what she'd been entitled to. He had done this before, not identically, but the outline was the same. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the pages Dorothy had printed at the public library. She didn't own a printer, she said, and she hadn't wanted to use mine in case I came home and saw them, and I felt something shift inside me that I don't think has ever shifted back. My daughter knew. That was the part I couldn't move past. Claire wasn't being deceived. She was participating. I want to be careful here because she is still my daughter, and I am still her mother, and those are not small things. I thought about who she had been at 7, and at 15, and at 22 when Gerald got his diagnosis, and she had driven 4 hours from Ottawa without being asked because she'd heard something in my voice on the phone. I thought about the person I believed her to be, and then I thought about the filing cabinet drawer, and she trusts me completely, and I let myself sit with both of those things at the same time, which is one of the hardest things a mother can do. I did not go to the graduation ceremony. I called Patricia, my lawyer, from my bedroom, and she told me the amendment had not yet been signed. We had a meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. She listened to what I told her in the silence she was professionally trained to maintain, and then she said, "Margaret, I'm going to need you to come in first thing tomorrow morning." She also gave me the name of a family lawyer she trusted. I called Thomas in Vancouver. That was the hardest call. He asked me 3 times if I was sure, and I said yes all 3 times. And then he was quiet for a long moment and he said, "What do you need from me?" And I loved him so much in that moment I couldn't speak. Then I asked Dorothy if she would stay for dinner. She said she'd already started soup. The graduation ceremony was over by 4 o'clock. I know because Claire called me at 4:15, cheerful and clear-voiced, telling me about the reception afterward, asking if I was feeling better, since Dorothy had told her I'd had a headache and hadn't been able to make it. She mentioned Preston had surprised her with a reservation at Alo for dinner. She said she wished I could have been there. I said I was sorry I'd missed it. I said we would celebrate soon. I said I loved her, which was true even then. She said she loved me too, which I chose to believe. I spent the following week moving carefully. Patricia had advised me not to change my behavior. Do not cancel the wedding venue. Do not mention what I knew. Do not alert Claire that anything had shifted. Patricia and the family lawyer, a woman named Diane Reeves who wore no jewelry and asked questions like scalpels, had advised me that what I needed was documentation, a paper record of what had happened and what had been said before I made any move. Dorothy had kept everything, every printout, every note. She had also, it turned out, written herself a private log since May, dates, times, what she'd heard, what she'd found. She had done this because, as she told me simply, she'd hoped she would never need to show it to me, but she'd wanted to be thorough just in case. 19 years. She had worked for us for 19 years, and I had not until that week fully understood what that meant. I signed the trust amendment on a Tuesday morning. Patricia had expedited it. I also restructured the trust itself, on Diane's recommendation, in a way that made any legal challenge considerably more difficult and considerably less rewarding. It was not, Diane was careful to tell me, designed to disinherit Claire. It was designed to protect what Gerald and I had built from someone who had decided to treat it as a transaction. On Wednesday, I called Claire and asked her to come for lunch on Saturday. I spent Thursday and Friday deciding what kind of mother I wanted to be. I am not a person who performs grief. Gerald used to say that about me, admiringly, though occasionally with a hint of frustration that I processed things internally, quietly, and emerged on the other side with a decision already made. He was louder in his emotions, more willing to say the difficult thing in the difficult moment. I used to think I was more rational. Now I think we were just different. And the truth, as it usually is, was somewhere in the complicated middle. I thought about what Claire had said. She trusts me completely. I thought about what that meant, what it revealed about the person my daughter had decided to be inside this relationship. I thought about Preston, and I thought about his ex-wife in Calgary, who had probably been someone's daughter too. I decided I was not going to ambush Claire. I was not going to perform righteous anger. Not because I didn't feel it, I felt it like something physical. Something I had to breathe around, but because I have learned that the moments when you most want to make someone feel the weight of what they've done are usually the moments when it's least useful to try. I wanted my daughter back. I wasn't sure I could have her. But I knew I couldn't reach her through a confrontation that let her put up walls and stand behind Preston and tell herself that I was the problem. Claire arrived at 12:30 on Saturday. She brought flowers, yellow tulips, the ones she knew I liked. She hugged me in the doorway and she smelled like her shampoo, the same kind she'd used since university, and I held on for a moment longer than usual. Dorothy had made lunch and then excused herself to visit her sister, because Dorothy understood things without being told. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had drunk the decoy coffee 5 days earlier, and I let Claire talk about the wedding for 20 minutes. The venue was confirmed. The dress had been altered. Preston's family was flying in from Edmonton. She was thinking about peonies for the centerpieces because roses felt too expected. I listened. I let her be happy, or let her perform happiness, or let the space exist where I could no longer tell the difference. Then I said, "I need to tell you about some changes I've made to your father's trust." She went still. Not dramatically, just the way a person goes still when something they were expecting and trying not to expect finally arrives. I told her clearly and without accusation. The amendment had been signed, the structure had been updated. I told her the name of the firm Preston had been researching. Harrington and Associates, estate litigation, Calgary and Toronto offices. I watched her face while I said it. She didn't deny it. That was the thing I hadn't been prepared for. I had prepared for anger, for tears, for defensive deflection. What I got was something quieter, and in some ways, worse. She looked down at her tulips, sitting in the vase between us, and she was very still, and she said nothing. "I'm not telling you this to end your relationship," I said. "I'm telling you because I love you, and because I think you've been told something or told yourself something that isn't true. About him. About what this is." She looked up then. "He said you would never understand," she said. Her voice was careful, measured. "He said you'd always found a way to keep the money close, to keep control." "I know," I said. "That's the story that makes what you did make sense." She flinched. I slid the folder across the table. Inside was a copy of the Calgary court records, the years of Preston's first marriage. His ex-wife's name was Sandra. The documentation of what the litigation had cost her. Claire didn't open it, but she didn't push it away. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the kind of silence that, with some people, would feel like a wall going up. With Claire, I had always been able to tell the difference. She had a kind of silence that meant she was actually listening, a quality she'd had since she was small, a willingness to sit inside something uncomfortable rather than fill it. I had always considered it one of her best qualities. I let her sit in it. "I didn't know about Sandra," she finally said. "I know you didn't. He wouldn't have told you. He made it sound like it was about protecting us, about protecting what we'd build together. He has money, Mum. He doesn't need yours." "Then why the lawyer?" I asked, quietly, not as an attack. She didn't answer. I did not pressure her. I told her I had made my calls. I told her the trust was protected, not as a punishment, but as something her father and I had built for her and for Thomas and for their children, and that I intended to keep it that way. I told her I wasn't asking her to leave Preston. That was her decision, and it would remain her decision, and I would not pretend that I could make it for her. I told her I was her mother, and I intended to stay her mother, and that was not contingent on what she decided. She left 2 hours later with the folder under her arm. I stood at the front window and watched her car go down the street, and I thought about Gerald, the way I always do when something happens that I would have needed to tell him. I thought about how he used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone was accepting that you couldn't carry everything for them, couldn't always step in front of what was coming. He had tried with his illness. He had not wanted me to see him diminished, and I had stood my ground and watched him anyway, because that was my right as the person who loved him most. I thought about daughters, and about trust, and about all the ways a person can be two contradictory things at once. Dorothy came back at 4 with butter tarts from the bakery on Mount Pleasant, because that is the kind of woman she is. We sat at the kitchen table again and drank tea and didn't talk much, which was exactly right. 3 weeks later, Claire called to tell me the wedding was postponed. She didn't say it was canceled. She said postponed. I didn't ask for more than she was ready to give. She came for dinner the following Sunday. Just the two of us. She brought wine and Ontario Riesling, a good one, from a vineyard near Niagara where we'd gone on a trip when she was 17. I don't know if she remembered that or if it was coincidence. Either way, I chose to take it as something. We didn't talk about Preston. We talked about Thomas's daughters, who were 6 and 9 and had just started skating lessons. We talked about a book we'd both read. We talked about Gerald, the way we were able to sometimes now, without the rawness, just the memory, sitting with us at the table like a welcome guest. At the end of the night, when she was putting on her coat, she turned to me in the hallway, the same hallway, and she said, "I didn't tell him anything after March, Mum. I want you to know that." When I started to see it, I stopped. I looked at her for a moment. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. She was quiet for a second. I think I was ashamed. I pulled her into a hug in the doorway, the same way I had when she'd arrived for lunch 3 weeks earlier. This time she was the one who held on longer. I don't know what happens after this. I am 63 years old, and I have learned that the phrase, "I don't know what happens after this," is not the frightening thing I used to think it was. Gerald taught me that. The last year of his life taught me most of the things worth knowing. What I know is this. I have a daughter who is, in some complicated and incomplete and still in progress way, finding her way back to herself. I have a lawyer named Diane who wears no jewelry and asks questions like scalpels. I have a trust that is protected. I have a son in Vancouver who calls every Sunday. And I have a housekeeper who has worked for my family for 19 years, who printed court records at the public library and kept a private log in a notebook she hoped I would never need to see, who made soup when I couldn't eat and bought butter tarts when words weren't enough. There is a kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up, quietly, in the hallway and tells you to get in the closet and trust it. I did, and it was the most important thing I could have done. If you are listening to this, and you have someone in your life who has shown up for you, that quietly, that steadily, without being asked, I hope you know what you have. I didn't, fully, until I was standing in the dark between a winter coat and a row of umbrellas, counting seconds I couldn't see. I do now.
"Don't come inside yet," my son said, and something in his voice made me stop with my hand on the car door. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of morning we get in Nova Scotia where the light comes in sideways and everything looks a little gold and a little cold at the same time. My son Elliot was getting married in 4 hours. I had been awake since 5. I had ironed my blouse twice. I was standing in the driveway of the house he shared with his fiancée. Well, her house, technically. She'd owned it before they met. That was something my late husband Gordon would have had opinions about, but Gordon had been gone 2 years and his opinions went with him, so I kept mine to myself and smiled every time she corrected me on how to pronounce her last name. Her name was Sable Renwick Oakes. 34 years old. She had a son from a previous relationship, a quiet little boy named, well, she called him Pip. I never did learn his legal name. She didn't offer it and I didn't push. "Don't come inside yet," Elliot said again. He was standing in the doorway in his dress shirt, not yet buttoned at the collar, and he looked, I don't know how to describe it, wound up, like a watch that's been turned too far. I said, "Is everything all right?" He said, "Just wait in the car, please. 5 minutes." I went back to the car. I sat there with my hands in my lap and the engine off, and I told myself it was pre-wedding nerves. I told myself I was reading into things because I was already emotional, already one deep breath away from crying, already missing Gordon so much it sat in my chest like a stone. I told myself a lot of things. Our neighbor from down the road, a man I've known for 20 years, a retired postal worker named Doug, he was the one who had driven me. I didn't want to deal with parking downtown, and Doug had offered. He was waiting with me in the car, and he didn't say anything for a while, which I appreciated. Doug has always understood when to talk and when not to. After maybe 3 minutes, he said quietly, "Marion." "That's my name, Marion." Marion Clyde, 67 years old, retired school librarian, widowed, mother of one, grandmother of none, yet but hoping. I looked at where he was pointing. Around the side of the house, coming through the gate from the backyard, was a man I had never seen before. He was maybe 40, wearing a jacket that was too light for the weather, carrying a banker's box with both hands. He walked quickly, head down, the way people walk when they don't want to be noticed. He went to a gray sedan parked on the street in front of the house, not a car I recognized, put the box in the back seat, and stood there for a moment with the door open, looking at his phone. I said, "Who is that?" Doug said, "I don't know. He came out of her back door." I watched the man get into the gray sedan and sit there. Not leave, just sit. Something moved in my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. The feeling you get when something is wrong but you can't name it yet. I got out of the car. Doug said, "Marion." I said, "I'm just gonna knock." I knocked. Elliot opened the door almost immediately, which meant he'd been standing right there, which meant he knew something was happening and didn't want me to see it. My son has never been a good liar. He got that from his father. Gordon could not look me in the eye and tell me anything other than the truth, not for 41 years. Elliot said, "Mom, I told you." I said, "Who is the man in the gray car?" A long pause. "What man?" I said, "Elliot. Who is he?" From somewhere inside the house, I heard Sable's voice, not the words, just the tone, clipped, low, the voice she used when she was managing a situation. She was a property manager. She managed things. She was very good at it. Elliot looked back over his shoulder and then looked at me, and I saw something cross his face that I hadn't seen since he was 16, and I caught him in a lie about where he'd been on a Friday night. A kind of calculation, a decision being made in real time. He said, "It's nothing, Mom. Come in. There's coffee." I went in. I drank the coffee. I watched Sable move around the kitchen in her silk robe, already in makeup, already composed, already performing the calm she wanted me to see. She kissed my cheek and said I looked wonderful. She topped up my mug without asking. She talked about the flowers at the venue and how the forecast was for cloud, but hopefully the ceremony would stay dry. She did not mention the man. Elliot did not mention the man. I did not mention the man. But when I excused myself to use the washroom, I went down the hall, and instead of turning left, I turned right, past the little room where Pip had his toys and his books, and I looked out the window at the side yard. The gray sedan was still there. I have been a librarian for 34 years. People think that's a quiet job, a background job, a job for people who like to stay out of things. But a library is not a quiet place, not really. A library is a place where people come with problems they don't know how to solve, questions they're embarrassed to ask, needs they can't name. You learn to read people. You learn to notice what's not being said. What wasn't being said that morning was filling up the whole house. Pip was upstairs. I could hear him moving around. Sable had told me he was staying with her sister during the honeymoon, 2 weeks in Portugal, which I knew cost money Elliot didn't particularly have, but Sable had insisted on Portugal and Elliot loved her, and that was that. I finished my coffee. I said I was going to go wait in the car while they finished getting ready, that Doug and I would meet them at the Harborview Hall at noon. Sable kissed my cheek again. Elliot hugged me a moment longer than usual and didn't say anything, just held on, and I felt the stone in my chest get heavier. I walked to the car. I did not look at the gray sedan. I got in and I sat down and I said to Doug, "The car is still there." He said, "I know." He got out once and walked around the block and came back. I said, "Something is wrong." Doug said, "Do you want me to drive away?" I said, "No." We sat there. We watched. The wind came off the water and moved through the maple in the front yard, and the gold leaves fell in that particular October way, unhurried and sideways, and I thought about Gordon, about our own wedding day 43 years ago in a church in Antigonish, about how he had cried and I had laughed at him for it, and then started crying myself. I thought about how I had known, that day, in the absolute center of myself, that this was right. that everything was right. I thought about whether Elliot felt that today. I thought about why he had told me to stay in the car. The front door of the house opened. Not Elliot, Sable. She came out in her robe, barefoot on the cold front step, and she walked quickly down to the gray sedan and leaned in through the driver's window. The conversation lasted maybe 90 seconds. I couldn't hear words. Her body language was tight, controlled. Not the body language of someone talking to a friend or a vendor or someone organizing a delivery. She straightened up, said something final. The man in the car nodded. She turned and walked back to the house without looking up. She did not see us. I don't think it occurred to her that we were still there. Doug said, very quietly, "Marion, that man. I've seen that car before." I turned to look at him. He said, "It was parked on your street, back in the summer. I noticed it because it sat there for 3 days and I didn't recognize it. I thought maybe someone was visiting the Chengs." I said, "You're sure it's the same car?" He said, "Gray Civic, cracked rear bumper sticker." "Yes, I'm sure." I watched the gray sedan. The man inside had his phone out again. He wasn't leaving. I said, "Doug, I need to know who that is." Doug is 71 years old and spent 30 years delivering mail to every address in our county. He knows more people and more places than anyone I've ever met. He also has a nephew who works with the RCMP in Truro, which is not the same thing as being police himself, but it means he knows the right questions to ask the right people. He took out his own phone. He wrote down the license plate. He said, "Give me until tonight." I said, "The wedding is at noon." He said, "I know, but you should go. You should be there for Elliot." I closed my eyes for a moment. In the library, we had a saying. Well, I had a saying, I'm not sure it was official policy, that the worst thing you could do when you didn't know something was pretend you did. The second worst thing was let the not knowing stop you from acting on what you did know. What I knew was this. My son looked frightened this morning. A strange man had taken a box out of his fiancée's back door and was sitting in front of the house on his wedding day. Sable had come outside in her bare feet in October to speak to him and had not mentioned it to anyone. And some quiet animal instinct I've carried my whole life, was telling me to pay attention. I said, "Drive me to the hall, but slowly. Tell me what you find out the moment you know." The Harborview Hall is a beautiful venue. I'll give her that. It looked out over the Bedford Basin, and in October, the water has a gray-green quality that is somehow more beautiful than summer blue, more honest. There were white flowers everywhere. Sable had very specific taste, and she had imposed it on every surface. My son was already there when I arrived, standing with his best man, a childhood friend named, well, I'll call him by the name we all use, which is Bax, short for Baxter, though I've called him that since he was 11 years old and stealing apples from my tree. And the two of them were standing by the window, and Elliot was pretending to be calm, and Bax was pretending not to notice that Elliot wasn't calm. I went to my son, and I held his face in my hands the way I hadn't done since he was small. I said, "Whatever is happening, you can tell me." He said, "Nothing's happening, Mom." I said, "Elliot." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "She needed to settle something this morning, a financial thing, something from before we met. She said it was taken care of." I said, "What kind of financial thing?" He said, "I don't know exactly. She didn't want to go into it today. I trust her, Mom." I said, "I know you do." I let go of his face. I went to my seat. I sat down. My phone buzzed. Doug. Plate is registered to a man named Hold On, a man out of Dartmouth. Rented the car. Rental registered against a name I'm running now. Nephew says it cross-references to a civil claim, something financial, unpaid. Marion, I think this man is a process server. I read the message twice. A process server. On her wedding day. I thought about the banker's box. I thought about Sable's bare feet on the cold step, that tight controlled conversation, that final word. I thought about Portugal. 2 weeks. Gordon had always said, and he was a man who understood money in a way that I respected without fully sharing. He'd always said that the people who spent the most carefully were the ones who spent other people's money. The wedding was about to start. I could hear the string quartet begin. I could hear the murmur of 60-some guests settling into chairs. I could see through the door that the aisle had those white flowers at every row, and the light was coming in off the basin, and it was, genuinely, very beautiful. My phone buzzed again. Doug. Civil claim is for debt recovery. Substantial. Marion, I need you to look at this. Can I forward you a document link? My nephew found something in the public record. I think you need to see it before they say their vows. I stood up. The woman beside me gave me a look. I apologized quietly and stepped out into the hallway. Doug forwarded me a link to a public court record, Nova Scotia Supreme Court Civil Division. A debt recovery action filed 14 months ago. The respondent's name was listed. It was not Sable Renwick Oaks. It was Sable Renwick, which meant the Oaks was added later, which meant she had been using a combined name that was not her legal name. Not on its own a crime. Plenty of people hyphenate informally. But the address listed in the court record was not the house on Cardiff Street where she lived with my son. It was an address in Cole Harbor, and the co-respondent on the debt claim, listed as jointly liable, was a man named her spouse. She had a spouse? A legal spouse, in Cole Harbor. I stood in the hallway of the Harborview Hall with the string quartet playing behind the door and the October light coming through the window over the basin, and I held my phone and I thought, this is the moment. This is the moment where you decide who you are. You can go back in. You can sit down. You can watch your son marry a woman with a spouse she hasn't mentioned and a debt she's hidden and a process server she sent away this morning. You can tell yourself it's not your business. You can tell yourself he's an adult. You can tell yourself maybe she's dealt with it, maybe there's an explanation, maybe love is enough. Or you can be his mother. I went back into the hall. I walked up the aisle. The music didn't stop. Not right away. People turned to look. I saw Sable at the far end, already at the front, stunning in a dress the color of winter cream, holding a small bouquet, and she watched me walk toward her with an expression that moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, confusion, and then, underneath both of those, something cold and careful that I recognized as a person calculating how much trouble they were in. I stopped in front of my son. I said quietly, so only he could hear, because I had thought about this in the hallway. I had thought about the comment from the woman who said a loving mother would have warned him privately, and she was right. I had tried this morning and he hadn't let me, but I could do it now. At least this much, at least between us. I said, I need to show you something, right now, before this goes any further. Elliot looked at me. Bax looked at me. The officiant, a pleasant woman from Wolfville who had driven 2 hours for this, looked at me. Sable said in a voice like cut glass, Marion, this isn't. I said, it never is. I turned to my son. Her legal name on record is Renwick, not Renwick Oaks. There is a civil claim in Nova Scotia Supreme Court naming her and a co-respondent listed as her spouse. That claim was filed 14 months ago. The address is in Cole Harbor. I handed him my phone. The court record is public. You can look right now. Silence. The string quartet trailed off. Elliot took my phone. He looked at the screen for a long time. I watched his face the way I'd watched his face for 40 years, through chicken pox and failed math tests and his father's funeral and every ordinary Tuesday in between. I watched him understand. He looked up at Sable. He said just one word. Well, and I watched Sable make a decision. I watched her choose, and in choosing, reveal everything. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse into an explanation. She straightened up slightly, the way she had on the front step that morning, that controlled composure, and she said, it's complicated. Elliot said, are you married? She said, we're separated. He said, that's not what I asked. A long pause. Yes, she said. Legally, yes. But it's not. It hasn't been real for years, Elliot. None of that changes what we. He handed me back my phone. He turned to the officiant. He said, I'm sorry. We need to stop. I will not tell you the rest of that day was easy. It was not. 60 people had to be thanked and sent home. The caterers still had to be paid. Bax drove Elliot to his apartment. Elliot had kept his apartment throughout the engagement, which at the time I'd thought was unnecessarily cautious and now understood as the thing that saved him. And I stayed at the hall and handled what needed handling, because that is what mothers do. We handle things, even when our hearts are breaking for our children. The man in the gray sedan, the process server, came back that afternoon. He had the documents he needed to serve. Sable had been avoiding him for 6 weeks. Her husband, her actual husband, had launched the debt recovery claim jointly with a collections agency. The money involved was significant. I won't say the exact figure because it's not my business to broadcast, but it was the kind of number that doesn't come from carelessness. It comes from intention. Pip, the little boy. I thought about him a great deal in the days that followed. He was not involved in any of this. He was a child. Elliot thought about him too. I know he did. He asked me once, about 2 weeks later, over dinner at my house, whether I thought Pip had known. I said no. I thought Pip was just a little boy living his life, and none of this was his fault. Elliot nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I thought I was going to be his stepfather. I said, I know. He said, I was looking forward to it. I said, I know that too. We sat with that for a while. The November rain was coming down outside my kitchen window, hard and steady, the way it does when the season really means it. And I had made the turkey soup Gordon always liked, the one with the barley, and we ate it, and we didn't try to make it better than it was. He asked me, eventually, how I had known. I told him about the banker's box. I told him about Doug and the gray sedan and the license plate and the court record. He shook his head slowly. He said, You almost didn't say anything. I said, I almost did it. He said, What made you? I thought about it. I thought about the hallway at the Harborview Hall, the light over the basin, the string quartet, the choice. I said, I thought about your father, about our wedding day, about how I knew that morning, in a way I can't explain, that everything was right. And I thought about how you looked this morning when you told me to wait in the car. And those were two very different feelings. He looked at me across the table. He said, I think I knew too. I just didn't want to know. I said, That's the hardest kind of knowing. He said, Yeah. Outside, the rain came down on the roof the way it has for every year of my life in this province. Steady and indifferent, and also somehow deeply familiar, like something that has always been here and will continue after all of us are gone. And I refilled his bowl without asking, and we sat together in the kitchen while the evening came on. And for the first time since that October morning, I felt the stone in my chest begin, slowly, to lighten. He was all right. My son was all right. And sometimes that is the whole of what a mother is working toward. Not the perfect day, not the beautiful venue, not the flowers at every route, just her child, safe. Just her child, free to find something real. That's enough. It has always been enough. I still think about that October morning more than I probably should. Not with anger. The anger passed a long time ago, but with a kind of quiet wonder at how close it came to going the other way. If Doug hadn't noticed the gray sedan back in the summer, if I had stayed in the car the way Elliot asked me to, if I had decided, the way I almost did, that it wasn't my place. There's a version of that day where I sit down, fold my hands in my lap, and watch my son marry a woman with a husband in Cole Harbor and a debt she'd been hiding for over a year. There's a version where I tell myself he's an adult, he made his choice, it's not my business. I came very close to that version. I want to be honest about that, because I think people don't often admit how close they come to the wrong door before they choose the right one. What stopped me wasn't instinct alone. Instinct told me something was wrong from the moment Elliot said, "Don't come inside yet." But instinct without the willingness to act on it is just discomfort. You feel it and you sit with it and nothing changes. What I had to find, standing in that hallway with the string quartet playing behind the door, was the courage to do something uncomfortable in order to do something right. Those two things don't always arrive together. I think about Sable sometimes too, and I don't think about her with contempt. I think about what it must take to build a life on concealment the way she had. The energy of it, the constant management. There's a kind of intelligence in that. She was organized, she was composed, she knew exactly what she was doing. But intelligence used that way hollows out. It doesn't build anything real. It only delays the moment when the structure collapses, and it always collapses because the foundation isn't there. The process server came back. The court record was public. Doug had known a man who knew the right question to ask. None of this was mysterious or extraordinary. The truth was simply sitting there in a database that anyone could access. It had been there for 14 months. The only thing required to find it was someone who thought to look. That's the part that stays with me. Not the drama of the hall, not the stopped music, not Sable's face when she understood it was over. What stays with me is the plainness of it. You pay your debts, you tell the truth. You don't build your future on someone else's willingness to not look too closely. These aren't complicated ideas. We teach them to children. The difficulty is not in understanding them. It's in living them when living them is inconvenient, when the lie is easier, when no one seems to be watching. Someone is always watching, not in any supernatural sense. I don't mean that. I mean that the world is made of people like Doug, who notice a gray car parked 3 days too long. People like Bax, who could see Elliot wasn't calm and stayed close anyway. People like the court clerk who filed a public record 14 months ago and thought nothing of it. Elliot is doing well. He took some time, the way you do after something like that, and then he got on with his life the way people do when they're fundamentally sound. He has his apartment, he has his mother who will always think to look. That's what I'd say to anyone sitting with a feeling they can't quite name, a moment where something is off and they don't know whether to speak. Trust the feeling. Find the patience to understand it. And then find the strength to act on what you know, even when it costs you something. It will cost you something. That's the part no one warns you about. But what it gives back is worth considerably more.
"Don't come inside yet," my son's fiancée said to me through the car window, and something about the way she said it made my hands go cold. It was a Tuesday morning in early October, one of those days in Halifax when the sky can't decide whether to be gray or blue, and the maple trees along the street were burning orange and red the way they do right before everything falls. My son Daniel was getting married in 4 hours. I had driven 40 minutes from Dartmouth to be at the house by 9, to help, to be useful, to be the kind of mother who shows up early, and now I was sitting in my car in the driveway, being told to wait outside. "Margaret is handling something," the fiancée Claire said. "Just give us 5 minutes." Margaret was Claire's mother. She had flown in from Calgary 3 days ago, and every time I had been in a room with her, I had felt like I was being assessed and found slightly lacking. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I said, "Of course," and I smiled, and Claire went back inside. I sat in the car. I looked at the orange trees. I thought about Daniel when he was 7 years old, how he used to climb the big oak in our backyard in Dartmouth until my husband Robert called him down every single time, voice tight with fear he never wanted to show. Robert had been gone for 4 years now. Heart attack, sudden, a Wednesday in February, and now I was sitting alone in a driveway on my son's wedding morning being told to wait. I should have driven away. I should have gone for a coffee at the Tim Hortons on the corner and come back in 5 minutes like a reasonable person. But instead I sat there, and I watched, and after about 3 minutes I saw something through the front window of the house that made me stop breathing. Margaret was on the phone. That was not strange. What was strange was the way she was on the phone, pacing back and forth across the living room, hand pressed over her mouth, then pulling it away to speak, then pressing it back. The body language of someone who does not want to be heard. The body language of someone afraid. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was a grieving widow projecting anxiety onto a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. I put my hand on the door handle. I was about to go inside. Then Margaret turned toward the window, and even through the glass in the distance, I could see her face clearly. I had raised 2 children. I had sat beside a hospital bed for 6 days waiting to find out if my husband's first cardiac episode 4 years before his death was survivable. I knew what fear looked like on a human face. That was not a woman making a routine phone call. I put my hand back in my lap. I waited. Claire came back out 5 minutes later, perfectly composed, and told me Margaret was so sorry. She just had a call from a friend going through something difficult. She was fine now. Please come in. We're so happy you're here. And I followed her inside, and I hugged Margaret, and I said good morning. And I watched Margaret's hands the whole time. They were shaking, just slightly. The way mine had shaken at Robert's funeral when I was trying very hard to hold myself together in front of the grandchildren. I noticed. I said nothing. I helped Claire with her veil. The thing about being 63 years old is that you have watched enough people lie to you that you develop a sense for it. Not a dramatic sense, not a movie sense where the music changes and you know something is wrong. Just a quiet, settling feeling in your stomach, like your body has registered information your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I'd had that feeling twice before in my life. Once when Daniel was 16 and told me he'd been at his friend's house when he hadn't been. Once when Robert told me the doctor's appointment had gone fine when it hadn't. Both times, I had known before I knew. I had that feeling all morning. I helped with the flowers. I made tea. I watched Margaret take 3 separate phone calls in the bathroom with the fan on, which in my experience is something people only do when they absolutely cannot be overheard. I watched Claire check her phone constantly in the moments between conversations, the way young people do when they're waiting for something urgent and trying not to show it. I told myself I was a nervous mother of the groom reading disaster into every small thing. I told myself today was a happy day, and I needed to let it be one. At 11:30, Daniel arrived to pick me up for the church. He looked so much like Robert in that suit, the same shoulders, the same way of standing slightly too straight when he was trying to appear relaxed. I hugged him for a long time. "You okay, Mum?" he said. "I'm wonderful," I said. "You look exactly like your father." He blinked, and for a moment he looked very young. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." We drove to St. Andrews United in Daniel's car. It was a 20-minute drive, and I spent most of it trying to decide whether to say something. What would I even say? I noticed your future mother-in-law was afraid this morning, and her hands were shaking. I watched Claire check her phone 40 times. This is nothing. This is a stressed family on a wedding morning. This is not a reason to say anything. I said nothing. The church was beautiful. White roses, September light through the tall windows. Wrong month. I know, I keep saying October, but it was late. September, the way I always mix up the dates around that time, because Robert died in February, and every autumn since then has felt dislocated from the calendar. The pews were filling up. Daniel's sister came and found me, and we sat together, and she squeezed my hand and said, "He's so happy, Mum." And I said, "I know he is." And I wanted to mean it fully. I wanted to sit in that pew and feel nothing but happiness for my son. I had been waiting for this feeling for 4 years. The first major family milestone without Robert. The first wedding. The moment I would sit in a church and watch my child begin his life with someone. Instead, my stomach felt like a closed fist. The ceremony was supposed to start at 1 o'clock. At 12:58, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "I need to speak with you. Please step outside. Side door, left of the altar. Please don't tell anyone. This is about Claire. I am not dangerous. Please come." I stared at it. My daughter leaned over and said, "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "Just I need to use the restroom. I'll be right back." I went out the side door. Standing in the narrow passage between the church and the garden wall was a woman I had never seen before. She was perhaps 40, dark-haired, wearing a coat that looked like she had put it on in a hurry. She was not dressed for a wedding. She was dressed like someone who had driven somewhere very fast and not thought about what she was wearing. "You're Daniel's mother," she said. "Yes," I said. "Who are you?" "My name is Patricia Walsh. I live in Mississauga." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Claire Hendricks is not who she told your son she is. I stood very still. Her real name, Patricia said, is Christine Lacombe. She grew up in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. She changed her name legally 11 years ago after she stopped again. After some things, I can explain if you give me time, but I don't have time. The ceremony is about to start. How do you know her? I said. Patricia looked at me. She was married to my brother, she said. They were married for 3 years. She left him 6 years ago without filing for divorce. She took money from his RRSP, his retirement savings, forged his signature on the withdrawal forms, and she was never charged because by the time he found the paperwork, she had already moved provinces twice. The September air was very cold against my face. I can show you the marriage certificate, Patricia said. She was already pulling out her phone. I can show you the court records. My brother has been trying to find her for 6 years. Not to hurt her, he just needs to finalize the divorce so he can move on with his life. He finally tracked her down 3 weeks ago. We didn't know about your son until 2 days ago. You flew here, I said. I drove, she said. 14 hours. I left yesterday morning. She said it without drama, the way people state facts that have cost them something they don't want to quantify. My brother couldn't come. This has been very hard on him, but I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let her do this again to someone. She held out her phone. I looked at the document on the screen. I am not a lawyer. I don't know how to authenticate a Quebec marriage certificate on a phone screen in a church alley in Halifax. But I know how to look at a photograph and see whether it has been tampered with, and this one hadn't been. And I know how to look at a woman's face and see whether she is telling the truth, and this one was. Does her mother know? I said. Patricia looked confused. Her mother died when she was 19. Margaret is her. I don't know who Margaret is. She's not family. I thought about Margaret shaking hands. I thought about 3 phone calls with the bathroom fan running. She's a friend, I said slowly, or she's something else. I don't know, Patricia said. I'm sorry. I know what today is. I know what I'm asking you to do. But if you let that ceremony proceed, your son will be married to a woman who is already legally married to someone else. Under Canadian law, that marriage will be void. And if she's doing what she did with my brother, she stopped. Is your son financially comfortable? I thought about Daniel's condo in the South End. Daniel's business, the small tech company he had built over 8 years, and sold a portion of last year for enough money to make me worry about people who might want to take it from him. Yes, I said, he is. Patricia nodded like this, confirmed something she had already feared. I stood in that alley for what felt like a long time and was probably 45 seconds. I thought about Robert. I thought about what Robert would do. Robert had been a man who believed in being certain before he acted, he used to say. If you're going to blow something up, make sure you know exactly what's inside it first. But he had also been a man who, when he was certain, did not hesitate. I was certain. Come with me, I said. I went back inside. I walked to the front of the church. I was aware of the entire congregation watching me. I was aware of Daniel standing at the altar looking confused. I was aware of the organ falling silent. I had approximately 30 seconds before this became a scene I could not control, and I needed to use them correctly. I walked directly to the officiant Reverend Campbell, who had christened Daniel 34 years ago and therefore knew my face, and I said quietly, I need to speak with my son before you begin. It is urgent. Please give us 3 minutes. Reverend Campbell has been conducting services for 40 years. She looked at my face and said, Of course, Margaret. She had called me by the wrong name. She always did this. Mixed up my name with my sister's, but I didn't correct her. I took Daniel by the arm, and I walked him to the vestry off the side of the altar. He was bewildered. He was not yet alarmed. That was the worst part. Mum, what? I need you to listen to me, I said. And I need you not to speak until I have finished. Can you do that? He looked at my face, and because he was his father's son, he said, Yes. I told him everything. I told him about the phone calls. I told him about Patricia in the alley. I told him about the marriage certificate, and the forged RRSP withdrawal, and the 6 years, and the 14-hour drive. I told him all of it in the flattest, most orderly way I could manage, because I knew that if I allowed any emotion into my voice, I would start to cry, and if I started to cry, he would comfort me instead of listening. He was silent for a very long time when I finished. Show me, he said. I brought Patricia in. She showed him everything on her phone, the marriage certificate, a court filing, a photograph of her brother and Claire at what looked like a backyard party somewhere in Ontario. Claire laughing, looking happy, looking exactly like herself. Daniel stared at that photograph for a long time. This could be fabricated, he said. His voice was completely steady. It could be, Patricia said. You can call the Registrar of Civil Status in Quebec. The marriage registration number is on the document. They will confirm it. Daniel took out his own phone. He looked up the number. He called it. He spoke in halting French. He'd taken it through high school and no further, and then he listened, and then he said thank you, and then he hung up. He stood there for a moment. The registration is valid, he said. He sat down on the small bench along the vestry wall. He put his elbows on his knees and his hands over his face. I sat beside him, and I put my hand on his back, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. And I had learned from losing Robert that sometimes adequate is not what people need anyway. Sometimes they just need to know there is someone beside them. After a few minutes, he said, "Does she know that I know?" "Not yet," I said. "I need to talk to her," he said. Before anything else happens, I need to hear it from her." This was so like him. So entirely, completely like him. Robert had been the same way. He had needed to look at things directly, needed to hear the words spoken, even when the evidence was already complete. "Of course," I said. We went back out. The congregation had been waiting in that particular suspended silence that descends on a church when everyone can tell that something is wrong, but no one knows what. Claire was at the back of the aisle, still waiting for the signal to begin her walk. She saw Daniel's face, and I watched her understand, in the space of about 2 seconds, that something had happened. Daniel said quietly, "Can we speak privately?" It was not a question. They went to the vestry. Patricia and I waited in the corridor outside. I could hear voices but not words. After about 8 minutes, Claire came out of the vestry alone. Her face was very controlled, the kind of control that takes practice, the kind that comes from having been in difficult situations before and having learned to manage your expression through them. She saw Patricia. Something shifted behind her eyes. "You had no right," Claire said. "I had every right," Patricia said. "He's my brother." Claire looked at me. "You don't understand the situation," she said. The circumstances with Thomas were complicated. I was going to handle it. I was going to file for a divorce you've been avoiding for 6 years, Patricia said. Claire stopped speaking. Margaret appeared from somewhere in the nave. She had clearly been watching for Claire to emerge. When she saw Patricia, her face went the color of old wallpaper. "Who is that?" Margaret said to Claire. "Go wait outside," Claire said to her. Margaret did not go outside. She stood there and looked at me, and what I saw in her face was not the fear I had seen that morning. It was something more complicated, something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like relief. "I told you," Margaret said to Claire. "I told you this would—" "Don't," Claire said. "I told you 3 months ago you needed to fix the situation before the wedding," Margaret said. "I told you we couldn't just—" She stopped. She looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. I knew there was a problem. I told her she had to deal with it. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know all of it. Daniel came out of the vestry. He looked older than he had an hour ago. That is the only way I can describe it. He looked like a man who has learned something that cannot be unlearned, and has already begun the process of deciding to carry it. "I've called the Halifax Regional Police non-emergency line," he said. He said it the way he said everything difficult, calmly, factually, with no performance of emotion. "They're sending someone to take a statement." "About the forged documents," Claire said. "Daniel." "I'm not angry," he said, and I believed him, which was perhaps the strangest part. I genuinely don't know what I am right now, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend the last 10 minutes didn't happen. He looked out at the congregation through the small window in the vestry door. "I need to go speak to our guests," he said. "Mum, will you come with me?" "Yes," I said. He went out and spoke to the congregation. He was honest and brief and dignified, and I have never been so proud of anyone in my entire life. He thanked people for coming. He said there would be no ceremony today. He said he was sorry for any inconvenience to anyone who had traveled. He answered no questions. He did not cry. He shook hands with Reverend Campbell on the way out. In the parking lot before he got into his car, he stopped and looked at me. "How did you know something was wrong?" he said. I thought about it. I thought about the phone calls and the shaking hands and the feeling in my stomach that had been sitting there all morning like something that had taken up residence without permission. "I didn't know," I said. "I just couldn't convince myself that nothing was wrong." "There's a difference." He nodded slowly. He put his arms around me, and I held my son in a church parking lot in Halifax on what should have been his wedding day. And I could feel him being very still the way he had been, very still as a small boy, when he was trying not to show me that something hurt. "Dad would have seen it earlier," he said. "Maybe," I said, "but you've got me, and I got there." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, but almost. He drove home. I drove home. Patricia Walsh drove back toward Mississauga, and I have her number in my phone, and I have texted her twice since then, because I felt she deserved to know that what she did mattered and that the 14 hours were worth something. The police took statements. The matter of the forged documents was referred to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, given that the withdrawals had crossed provincial boundaries. The last I heard, through a lawyer Daniel retained, the process of locating and addressing Christine Lacombe's legal situation was ongoing. These things take time. I've learned that. Margaret called me 2 weeks after the wedding that wasn't. She called from Calgary, and she was quiet for a moment before she said anything. Then she said, "I want you to know I tried to stop it. I want you to know that when I found out about some of it, not all, but some, I told her she had to be honest with Daniel before the wedding. She told me she would handle it. I believed her because I wanted to. I'm sorry." I thought about that for a moment. "Did you know about the previous marriage?" I said. "No," she said. "I knew there had been someone before. I didn't know about the marriage. I didn't know about the money. I believed her. I don't know if that's the right instinct, but I believed her." "Thank you for calling," I said. "We haven't spoken since, but I think she meant it. Daniel is all right. He is not the same as he was before that Tuesday morning. But I have come to believe that all right and the same are two different things, and the first one is enough. He sees a therapist, which is something Robert's generation would never have considered, and which I consider one of the genuine improvements of the current era. He goes to work. He calls me on Sundays. Last month he called on a Sunday and he said, "Mom, I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask." "That feeling you had, the one you said you couldn't talk yourself out of." He paused. "Do you think I should have felt it too? Is there something wrong with me that I didn't see it?" I have thought about this question many times since he asked it. "She was showing you love," I said. "Real or not, she was showing it toward you. It's very hard to see clearly through that. I wasn't the one she was loving. I was just the one standing off to the side." He was quiet. "There's nothing wrong with you," I said. "There was something wrong with the situation." "That's different." "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said. "The maples outside my window in Dartmouth are bare now. Winter is coming in off the Atlantic, the way it always does, sudden and committed, and I have closed up the garden for the season and found Robert's old wool sweater in the hall closet and washed it and put it in my drawer. I don't know what the future looks like for Daniel. I don't know when or whether he'll find someone, or what that will look like, or whether I'll be around to sit in a different church on a different morning and feel only happiness without the closed fist in my stomach. I hope I will. I hope he does. What I know is this. I sat in a driveway on a Tuesday morning in late September, and I felt something my body registered before my mind did. And instead of talking myself out of it, I waited. I watched. I walked out a side door when a stranger texted me, because something in me knew that the text was real, and the fear was real, and the morning was not what it appeared to be. And my son drove home from that church with his name still his own, his savings still his, and his future still open. I think Robert would have said that's enough. And if you are listening to this, and you have ever felt that thing, that quiet settling in your stomach that comes before your mind has caught up, I want you to know, you are not being paranoid. You are not being dramatic. You have spent your whole life learning to read the world, and sometimes your body finishes the sentence before your brain does. Trust it. Wait. Watch. You don't have to blow anything up. You just have to not look away. If this story moved you in any way, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you have a story of your own, a moment when you knew before you knew, a morning that changed everything, leave it in the comments. I read every one. I always do.